Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to WX Live webinar number 157. Today is July the 17th, 2015, and this is another installment of Uncle Pete's Corner. Today he's going to be discussing using jQuery to work around a WebDev bug. So it's all yours, Pete.
All righty. So, like Tim was saying, what we're going to do today is look at a bug that I found in version 20 that, to give the folks over in France credit, it's a pretty specific bug that I can definitely understand how it's filtered through the cracks and managed to get out there. It's been reported, and hopefully we'll get a fix for it. But as I often preach, clients don't care if it's your development environment's bug or Windows bug or what. They just want a solution to their issue, and that's what you need to provide. So regardless of where or whose bug it is, I needed to get a solution. And the bug, this specific bug is if you're using a pop-up page on a web page, and then you put a tab control on that pop-up page, and your page, your base web page has anchoring by height. If those three conditions are met, then what happens is your tab control doesn't render correctly. And the easiest way to do this is we'll just take a quick look here at the difference. This one, we've got a web page, we display the pop-up, and notice our tab control is the exact same width as this static with a border that I have below it. Now, if we go back and we look at this page, the only difference between these two pages is you noticed this one centered itself in the browser, and that's because I have anchoring set to anchor both width and height centered. Now if we display that same pop-up, notice our tab control has now extended out past that static and has pushed everything out and made everything render incorrectly. And if we look at it at design time, we can look at both of those pop-ups look identical. There's the one with anchoring, and there's the one without anchoring. So the only difference between these two pages is if we look at the anchoring of the page, this one is set to only anchor horizontally, meaning it's only going to move around side to side. It's not going to affect the height at all. As long as I don't affect the height via anchoring, the pop-up works fine. But this one is set to anchor centered both horizontally and vertically. And as soon as I do that, then I have that issue with the tab control on the pop-up page. And it's true of any of the anchorings, be it the extend or to move the bottom or the center. Any anchoring that you affect the height, it causes this bug to show up. And again, it's only if you're using a tab control on a pop-up page on a web page that has height anchoring. So it's a lot of conditions that have to be met before you run into the bug. But for the particular site I'm working on, we definitely needed that exact set of conditions for almost every page of our site. So, again, it's been recognized as a bug. Hopefully we'll get a fix for it, but at the end of the day, I need to move on and get some work done. So now it becomes, the first thing I need to do is figure out what exactly is causing the bug, what's making that happen. And of course, the beauty And the downfall of WebDev is it's depending on HTML and CSS. Everything's exposed to you at the end of the day via the HTML side of things. There is no mystery black box. The browser only recognizes HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if we run the site again, close that one, and we'll go to the one that does not work, display the pop-up. And this is what we're really doing today is really taking an in-depth look at how to use the Chrome developer tools or Firebug or whatever you prefer to examine the rendered HTML code of your site, to experiment and tweak and do all those things. So that's what we're really doing today, is getting a little more in-depth into how we do that. So the first thing I want to do is right-click and do Inspect Element on the tabs. And if we look, we'll see that our tab control is actually a table, an HTML table, which shouldn't surprise any of us that deal with HTML at all. Almost everything rendered on the web is some form of an HTML table. And then the next thing we'll see is that the top row of the table, which is what represents the two pane tabs and the extra space, is made up of a table row that has 3 cells. Our 2 panes, pane 1 and pane 2, and then a filler cell, which is supposed to take up the space from that last pane out to the edge of our tab control. But if we look closely, we'll see where the bug is. Our entire tab control is 295 pixels. The cell for the first tab is 52 pixels. The cell for the second tab is 52 pixels. And then our filler tab is defined as 295 pixels. Well, that's the entire width of our cell. So what's happening is that that final filler cell, somewhere in the code on the WebDev side of things, it's not taking into account the width of the actual cells that were defined to display the tabs. It's using the full width. So that's what's causing our tab control to get expanded out. And of course, it gets even worse if we had 5 tabs. This problem would be even worse, because we would have 5 tabs of space that's not getting accounted for, which was the case in my production version of this. The tab control was extending out almost 1,000 extra pixels. So now we see where the code is wrong. It's this 295. At least that's my theory. So the next thing is, how do I confirm that? Well, I could jump over to WebDev and start figuring out how to get some kind of code in place that will affect this code. But this is where the Chrome developer tools really become powerful, is because we can tweak our code on the fly, see the effect of that code, and know for sure what the effect will be before we ever write a line of code in WebDev. So if we change 295, we've got 252 that weren't accounted for, so that's 104. So if we take 104 minus 52, we get 191. So if we change this to 191, and we also change, you notice it already rendered correctly now, but I prefer to also change the cell as well as the div tag. The way HTML renders, sometimes, and it's very browser specific what will cause an expansion and what won't. And at least for Chrome, just the div inside the cell was actually pushing it out, but the cell should be defined as the correct width as well. So, and as I changed both of those to 191, we now see that our tab control and our pop-up page renders correctly. So I've now confirmed what I need to change in the code to get that to render correctly. So that's step one. And you've seen how Chrome Developer Tools let me slice and dice and experiment with that and figure that out. And that's really the lesson for today, is knowing HTML, CSS, and being able to use these tools give you a lot of advantages. But before we move on to the actual fix, I need to confess something. Although I said this fixed our problem, if we look really close, and I doubt you'll be able to see in the webinar, but our tab control is actually a few pixels wider than it should be rendered. It should be the exact same width as static, and it's a few pixels wider still. Well, why is that? Well, if we go back and we take a look and we highlight the first tab cell in the element inspector, and we come over to the computed tab, we see that as we saw here, 52 pixels wide, but we also have this 1 pixel border that's that gray line next to our tab control. And we see that the other one also has a pixel, and then our filler also has a 1 pixel border. So that's 3 extra pixels that are being used. So when we did our 295 minus 104, we didn't account for those pixels. So then if you do the math, you come up with, well, it should really be 189, 3 pixels less. So if we change to 189, now our tab control is even closer, but it's still off. And I know you can't see this in the webinar, but it's still off 1 pixel. And I've got a confession to make. I have no idea. I've dug around a little bit. I can't figure out where that 1 extra pixel is coming from. It's somewhere in a padding or a margin or something, but we're getting 1 extra pixel still. But the really great thing about this is I know a way to find out what that number is without doing any math. And I really like not doing any math. So now what we're going to do, instead of using inspect element, we're going to view page source. But first, notice our filler cell has this class WDOT on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on our page again. This time we're going to do view page source instead of inspect element. And we're going to search. Let me blow this up for you. We're going to search for WDOT. It has 2 instances of it. And if we search for the second instance, we see that's the exact code that we've been looking at when we were expecting the element. Except notice here it's defined as 187 pixels. Well, what's going on here? Why, when we view the code, does it show 187, but when we inspect the element, it's showing 295? This is something that'll kind of help you understand the difference between JavaScript, jQuery, that type of thing versus your actual WebDev HTML Remember, JavaScript and jQuery is all performed on the browser. Viewing the source code is looking at the actual HTML file that the browser downloaded from your WebDev site. So when we downloaded the page, this is what the code looked like. It said 187 pixels. Then somewhere in WebDev's JavaScript libraries, they're issuing a command that's changing that to 295 pixels. So somewhere via jQuery or JavaScript or something, they're affecting this and changing it from 187 to the 295, which we know is incorrect. Don't even ask me to dive into their JavaScript libraries and figure out where and how that code's coming about. That's for the folks in France's job there. All I know is I can now see that 187 was the correct value, and somewhere it got adjusted to the 295. So 187 is the actual value that I should be using over here. And if I do 187, we'll see that our tab control is now rendered at exactly the right width. So what that was really about was helping you understand the difference between your HTML view source versus inspect element. Inspect element shows you what the current value is. So that this is what is actually being displayed in the browser right now versus view source, which is what was originally downloaded from the web page before any JavaScript jQuery was ran against it. So now that we know 187 is the value we need to change, all we need to do now is figure out how to affect that change. Well, that's where jQuery comes in handy. All we need is 2 lines of jQuery code. And if you've been following this series we've been doing on CSS and JavaScript and jQuery, you've seen where I've used some advanced jQuery selectors, and that's all we're doing today. Remember, our line that we need to change has this, it's a cell that has this WDOT class on it. So if we look at our jQuery line, we're looking for any TD tag that has the class of WDOT, and we're changing the CSS property of width to 187 pixels. So that changes the TD. Now the next selector is even a little more advanced, and again, if you're used to CSS code, this is the same type of selector you would use in CSS. And this is saying, okay, that same TD with a WDOT class, any divs inside that TD also change their width to 187 pixels. So the only hard part of this code was getting the selector formatted correctly. And then once we do that, if we run the page, we do that, and we display the pop-up, and we see that indeed our pop-up now renders correctly without any tweaking. And if we look at the inspect element, we see that indeed 187 is now the value that's getting in here. And the reason why is because of those 2 lines of jQuery we did. So as you see, knowing CSS, knowing HTML, knowing jQuery, knowing how to use the browser developer tools are all important pieces of tech in your arsenal when you're doing web dev development. This is a bug that I experimented with, but, you know, trying to figure out exactly what was causing the bug, and just could not figure out any normal way to work around that bug. So if I didn't know how to do this bit of jQuery, I just would have had to give up on using tab controls on pop-up pages, and I would have had to go down a completely different road of designing our website, or sit on my hands and hope that the folks in France get the bug fixed. Well, neither one of those options is an option that I want to present to my client. So, you know, again, at the end of the day, I need to provide them a fix. But, you know, along with being able to work around this bug, these same tools let you do a lot of other things and really start understanding how your site's put together, so that if you do want to do some advanced tweaking, you know how to do it. You can experiment with it without having to figure out how to get it done in WebDev. And I almost always do that. I use the inspect element tool and experiment with the CSS settings and the HTML code, and see what does and doesn't work before I ever even go over and figure out how to generate that code in WebDev. You know, so that keeps me from, you know, there's two different things. I have to know how to generate the HTML, the CSS, and the jQuery code, but then I also have to know how to do that inside WebDev and work within its restrictions and so forth. So by separating that and doing first the developer tools and figuring out what the CSS settings and so forth need to be, I've made my life a little simpler, because now I'm not wondering, well, was it that WebDev, I did something wrong in WebDev that's causing the problem, or did I do something wrong in the CSS code that's causing the problem? I first get my CSS and stuff working properly, then it's just a matter of getting that into WebDev. So that's it today, as promised. Much shorter than last week's presentation.
That's good stuff, Pete. 25 minutes. Do you have nothing else that you need to share with us?
I can show you the new dynamic tab. I've got that interface completely working now. You know, that's one of the new features of version 20. And let me just run this site. So this is using the new dynamic tab interface. And we can come over here to customers, dealers, and you see as I open new ones, they just open up additional browsers. And then as I edit customers, you notice it just opens a tab for the forms. So our tabs just keep growing. You know, every page we open becomes a tab in the interface. But now where the dynamic tabs really get nice is we can grab these, pull them out into separate windows. We can redock them. And then this is the part that I've been working on this week. Let's drag a couple of these out onto one of my other monitors. Now we'll come back over to the customer browse. And the first one I'm going to do is Doug Eaton. So you see Doug Eaton right here. Watch that name as I come over to the form and make a change to that name and click Save. And notice when I did that change is reflected on the browse. That's a combination of using the dynamic tabs of version 20, using Andy's file manager classes, and then a little class that I put together to do some management of the dynamic tab. So yeah, as we make changes to our forms, whether they're part of the tabs or not, our browse immediately reflects those changes, and our interface. So this is the new interface that most of Windows apps are going to. You know, it's kind of an extension of the browser interface. Everything opens in a tab, and then you can pull the tabs out into separate windows or not. And so far, I'm liking it. It's obviously much nicer for the users because now they can have two forms open at once if they need to move one off onto a separate monitor because they're creating a new order that's similar to an old order. They could drag the old order off into a separate page and use it for reference as they're working. A lot of different things that this interface does for the users.
Mm-hmm. Very nice.
Yeah, very nice, Pete.
So, but that's just a reminder that yeah, I do occasionally do Windows work as well.
Okay, well that was short and sweet, very informative. And as always, I'm sure Pete will have a blog post, and we'll post that on the YouTube.
Yep.
In the YouTube video area, so you can have a look at that. All right. Well, anything else?
No, that's it for me. If we don't have any questions or anything.
Wolfgang, anything from you?
No, it was a good presentation and quite a few good tips for people.
Yeah, good.
Compact and short, but I think if you don't understand it, it might be a good idea to look at it again.
Mm-hmm. And
yeah, like I said, the real point is not so much this specific bug, which unless you're doing those specific things, the bug will never affect you. But the real lesson here is how those same tools can do a lot of other things for you.
Yeah. Just quickly, did you try and putting into a div or a cell pane, cell, whatever they call it, when you create a cell? A div.
Create a cell around the tab.
Yeah, that would have worked. That would have been
it might possibly, but I doubt it, since there's nothing in the WebDev interface for that cell that's it's that filler cell that they're generating dynamically that's causing a problem. So I think if I put a cell around the entire tab control,
that's what I'm saying.
Tab control would still be extended. You just I could keep the page from getting extended, but I don't think that would keep the tab control from getting extended.
Oh, you think it will still extend within the div?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing the div would do is control, contain it, but
contain it, yeah, as a group to anchor it. Otherwise, not much else help.
Yeah, and I played with display block and a few of those type of things to see if they would correct it and
help you along.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So like I said, once I found it, it was very easy to fix via those two jQuery lines. Of course, the downside is if you edit that window and make your tab larger, you're going to have to
also
adjust that code
to
be the correct code.
Yeah. Okay.
And I will definitely let everyone know if and when I hear from the folks over in France with a actual bug fix for the issue.
Yeah. All right, very good. Well, if no one has anything else, we'll go ahead and stop the broadcast. Thanks again, Pete.
All right.
Thank you, Pete, and enjoy your weekend.
Okay, so somebody out there in webinar land needs to step up and volunteer for next week.
Amen.
Yep.
Have a good one. Bye all.